The sledgehammer crashes down on concrete as Sarah dismantles her own pool, sweat dripping in the summer heat. Across the fence, Karen's face twists with rage. How dare her neighbor make this choice without permission? But when the police sirens wail and the officers step out laughing, Karen's about to discover that some battles you pick will destroy everything you thought you knew about power, property, and the dangerous game of revenge. The sledgehammer felt heavier with each swing, but Sarah Chen pressed on, her muscles burning as she brought it down against the concrete edge of her backyard swimming pool. Chunks of debris scattered across the patio she'd spent 3 summers perfecting, but she didn't care anymore. Not after everything that had happened. "Sarah, honey, are you sure about this?" Her husband David called from the sliding glass door, their 6-year-old daughter Emma clinging to his leg. "Maybe we should hire professionals." "No." Sarah wiped sweat from her forehead with the back of her gardening glove. "I need to do this myself." The pool had been her dream once. Crystal blue water reflecting summer sunsets, Emma's delighted. Squeals during swimming lessons, weekend barbecues with friends gathered around the deck chairs. Now it was just a concrete grave, filled with memories she couldn't bear to look at anymore. Emma had nearly drowned in that pool 3 weeks ago, not for their neighbor Mrs. Patterson's quick thinking and CPR training. Sarah would be planning a funeral instead of demolition. The thought sent another surge of determined fury through her arms as she swung again. "Excuse me." The shrill voice cut through the afternoon air like a buzzsaw. Sarah paused mid-swing, her heart sinking as she recognized the tone. She turned to see Karen Whitmore marching across her pristine lawn, perfectly coiffed blonde hair bouncing with each indignant step. Karen had moved in 6 months ago, immediately transforming the quiet cul-de-sac into her personal kingdom. She'd already filed noise complaints against the Johnsons for their weekend barbecues, reported Mrs. Patterson's garden gnomes, as aesthetically offensive, and somehow gotten elected as the unofficial head of the non-existent homeowners association. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" Karen planted herself at the edge of Sarah's property line, her manicured hands on her hips. Sarah set down the sledgehammer and faced her neighbor. "Removing my pool, without proper permits. Without notifying the neighborhood committee." "What? Neighborhood committee?" Sarah's voice carried a dangerous edge. "And it's my property, Karen. I can do whatever I want with it." Karen's face flushed pink beneath her foundation. "There are procedures, Sarah, standards to maintain. Do you have any idea what this destruction is doing to our property values?" "Frankly, I don't give a damn about your property values." The words hung in the air between them like a thrown gauntlet. Karen's mouth opened and closed several times before she found her voice again. "Well, you can't just, there are rules." "Show me the rules, Karen." Sarah picked up the sledgehammer again. "Show me one single rule that says I can't modify my own backyard. The city, the county, there are noise ordinances." Sarah glanced at her watch. "It's 2:30 on a Tuesday afternoon. Well, within acceptable hours for construction work. This is vandalism. It's my pool." Karen's face was approaching a dangerous shade of red now. "You're destroying the character of this neighborhood. I've worked too hard building relationships with the right people to let some what, Karen?" Sarah's voice went deadly quiet. Karen seemed to realize she was treading on thin ice, but her pride wouldn't let her back down. "Some irresponsible homeowner who makes rash decisions without considering how they affect the rest of us." The sledgehammer trembled in Sarah's grip. She thought of Emma's blue lips, the paramedics working frantically in her backyard, the 3 days her daughter had spent in the hospital hooked to monitors while doctors watched for signs of brain damage. "Irresponsible," she repeated softly. "Yes, exactly, and I won't stand for it." David appeared at Sarah's shoulder, his face tense. "Karen, I think you should go home." "Don't you tell me what to do, David. This affects all of us." Karen gestured broadly at the other houses on the street. "Property values, neighborhood standards, quality of life. Our daughter almost died in that pool." Sarah's words cut through Karen's rant like a blade. Karen barely paused. "Accidents happen, Sarah, but that doesn't mean you can just." She was underwater for nearly 2 minutes. Destroy property without considering. She wasn't breathing when Mrs. Patterson pulled her out. The impact on the rest of us, who stopped talking. Sarah's roar echoed across the neighborhood. Birds erupted from nearby trees. Even the distant sound of traffic seemed to pause. Karen stepped back, but her expression remained defiant. "You don't get to yell at me. I have rights too." "Rights?" Sarah's laugh held no humor. "You want to talk about rights? You moved here 6 months ago and immediately started trying to control everyone around you. You complained about Mrs. Patterson's wind chimes, the same wind chimes that alerted her when Emma fell into the pool because she could hear them stop spinning when the gate opened. You wanted them removed, Karen. You filed 3 separate complaints. That's different. You reported the Johnsons for having friends over on weekends. You know what those friends do? They're volunteer firefighters and paramedics who happened to be here the day Emma nearly drowned. They helped save my daughter's life." Karen's mouth worked soundlessly. "And now you want to lecture me about responsibility while I'm tearing down the pool that almost killed my child because it's affecting your property values. I didn't know you didn't want to know." You've been so busy playing neighborhood dictator that you never bothered to actually get to know any of us. David put his hand on Sarah's shoulder, but she shrugged him off. You know what, Karen? I'm done being polite. I'm done pretending your opinions matter. This is my house, my yard, and my pool, and I'm going to demolish every inch of it whether you like it or not. Sarah turned back to the pool and raised the sledgehammer. Wait, Karen's voice cracked with desperation. You can't just dismiss me like that. I have standing in this community. The sledgehammer crashed down, sending concrete chunks flying. One piece skittered across the lawn and came to rest near Karen's designer shoes. I'm calling the police, Karen shrieked. Sarah didn't pause in her swinging. Go ahead, I'm serious. This is disturbing the peace. Destruction of property. There are laws. Another chunk of concrete exploded under Sarah's blow. Fine, fine. Karen stomped toward her house, her heels clicking angrily against the sidewalk. Don't say I didn't warn you. Sarah continued working as Karen's front door slammed shut with enough force to rattle the windows. David lingered nearby, clearly wanting to say something but knowing better than to interrupt when his wife was in this mood. 20 minutes later, the sound of sirens filled the air. Sarah straightened up, wiping sweat from her face as a police cruiser pulled into her driveway. Two officers got out, one older with graying hair and a tired expression, the other younger and clearly trying to look serious. The older officer approached first. Ma'am, we got a call about a disturbance, officer. Sarah squinted at his name tag. Rodriguez. Someone's disturbing the peace. That's what we're here to find out. Rodriguez looked around the yard, taking in the partially demolished pool, the scattered concrete, and the sledgehammer in Sarah's hands. You doing some renovation work? Removing a pool from my own backyard. The younger officer, according to his badge, pulled out a notebook. Do you have permits for this work? Do I need permits to remove something from my own property? Rodriguez and Martinez exchanged glances. Well, that depends on the scope of the work and local ordinances, Rodriguez said carefully, but generally speaking, minor demolition on private property doesn't require officers. Thank goodness you're here. Karen burst out of her house like she'd been shot from a cannon, still wearing the same outfit, but now accessorized with a self-righteous expression and a manila folder clutched to her chest. This woman is destroying neighborhood property values with unauthorized construction. Karen marched up to the officers, positioning herself between them and Sarah. I've documented multiple violations of city noise ordinances, improper disposal of construction materials, and willful disregard for community standards. Officer Martinez looked confused. Ma'am, are you the homeowner? I'm Karen Whitmore, president of the Maple Street Neighborhood Watch Committee. Karen's voice carried the authority of someone used to being obeyed. I've lived here for 6 months, and I've been working tirelessly to maintain the quality and character of this community. Rodriguez's eyebrows rose slightly. 6 months. Yes. And in that time I've identified numerous issues that require immediate attention. This, Karen gestured dramatically at Sarah's yard, is just the latest example of the kind of reckless behavior that's been plaguing our street. Sarah leaned against her sledgehammer, suddenly fascinated by the performance unfolding. In her driveway, ma'am, Officer Martinez said slowly. You called in a noise complaint about someone working on their own property at 2:30 in the afternoon. It's not just about noise. It's about proper procedures, community standards, property values, values, Rodriguez repeated flatly. Yes. Do you have any idea what unauthorized demolition does to? Part 2. 3 days after the police incident, Sarah woke to find her mailbox stuffed with official-looking envelopes. Her stomach dropped as she pulled out letter after letter. City Building Department, County Health Services, Environmental Protection Agency, Homeowners Insurance Company. Every single complaint had been filed by Karen Whitmore. David, Sarah called as she stormed back into the house. Papers scattered across the kitchen table. Look at this. David emerged from the bathroom, still in his pajamas, and whistled low as he scanned the documents. Unauthorized construction, potential, environmental hazards, insurance liability concerns, noise violations, ... He looked up at his wife. She's been busy. This is harassment. Sarah's hands shook as she opened another envelope. Pool demolition without proper environmental impact assessment? What environmental impact? It's a backyard swimming pool, not a nuclear waste site. Emma wandered into the kitchen, still rubbing sleep from her eyes. Mommy, why are you yelling? Sarah immediately softened her voice. Sorry, sweetheart. Mommy's just dealing with some grown-up nonsense. But as Emma climbed into her chair for breakfast, Sarah noticed her daughter's eyes drift toward the sliding glass door that looked out onto the partially demolished pool. The little girl's face tightened with anxiety, the same expression she'd worn every day since the accident. That decided it. Karen wanted a war. She'd get one. Sarah spent the morning on the phone methodically calling each agency that had sent letters. The conversation with the building department was typical. Mrs. Chen, we've received a complaint about unauthorized demolition work at your residence. I am removing a pool from my own backyard. Do you have permits for this work? Do I need permits to remove something from my own property? A pause. Well, that depends on the scope of work and disposal methods. Are you hiring a licensed contractor? I'm doing it myself with a sledgehammer. Another pause. I see. And how are you disposing of the debris? I rented a dumpster. From a licensed waste management company. Yes. And you're not disturbing any utility lines or affecting drainage. It's a above-ground pool with no plumbing connections. A longer pause. Mrs. Chen, I'm going to be honest with you. This complaint seems ... excessive. Small-scale demolition on private property typically doesn't require permits unless you're affecting structural elements or utilities. But since a formal complaint has been filed, we'll need to send an inspector out. When? Tuesday of next week. There's a $50 inspection fee. Sarah hung up feeling like she needed a shower. Every agency told her the same thing. The complaints were likely frivolous, but since they'd been filed officially, they had to investigate. Inspection fees, processing costs, administrative charges. By lunchtime, Sarah had racked up over $300 in fees just to prove she had the right to demolish her own pool. That afternoon, she was back in the yard with her sledgehammer. When Mrs. Patterson appeared at the fence line, the elderly woman looked troubled. Sarah dear, I hope you don't mind me asking, but have you had any strange visitors lately? Sarah paused mid-swing. What kind of visitors? Well, Karen came by yesterday asking all sorts of questions about you and David, your work schedules, Emma's school, how long you've lived here. Mrs. Patterson twisted her hands nervously. She said she was conducting a neighborhood safety survey, but something felt off about it. A chill ran down Sarah's spine. What kind of questions? She wanted to know if I'd ever seen any concerning behavior from your family, if Emma was properly supervised, if you and David ever fought or drank too much, ... double quotes. Mrs. Patterson's voice trailed off. I told her it was none of her business, of course, but she was very persistent. Sarah set down the sledgehammer. She's going door to door asking about us. I'm afraid so. She also asked about the day Emma had her accident. Wanted to know exactly what happened, who was home, how long Emma was in the water, ... Mrs. Patterson looked genuinely distressed. Sarah, I think she's trying to build some kind of case against you. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. The complaint letters weren't just harassment, they were reconnaissance. Karen was looking for any angle, any vulnerability she could exploit. What did you tell her about the accident? Sarah asked quietly. The truth? That Emma wandered outside while you were putting away groceries, that the pool gate must not have latched properly, and that I heard the splash from my garden. Mrs. Patterson reached over the fence to squeeze Sarah's hand. You're a wonderful mother, dear. What happened was a terrible accident, nothing more. But Sarah's mind was already racing ahead, imagining how Karen might twist those facts. Negligent? Supervision? Unsafe property conditions? Child endangerment? Has she talked to anyone else? The Johnsons? The Martinezes? Probably others. Most people aren't giving her the time of day, but Mrs. Patterson hesitated. The new couple who moved in last month, the Hendersons, they seemed quite interested in what she had to say. Sarah felt like the ground was shifting beneath her feet. I need to make some calls. That evening, after Emma was in bed, Sarah and David sat at the kitchen table surrounded by complaint letters, legal documents, and printouts from Sarah's frantic internet research. She can't actually do anything, can she? David asked, though his voice lacked conviction. I don't know. Sarah rubbed her temples where a headache was building. She's filed complaints with every agency she can think of. She's questioning our neighbors about our parenting. She's trying to turn a family tragedy into evidence of negligence, but surely people can see through, can they? Sarah's voice rose slightly. Then she caught herself and lowered it again. David, she moved here 6 months ago, and she's already convinced herself she's the neighborhood authority. She got Mrs. Patterson's wind chimes classified as a nuisance. She nearly got the Johnsons fined for having friends over. What if she finds the right bureaucrat who's having a bad day and decides, our situation needs investigation? David was quiet for a long moment. What are you thinking? I'm thinking we need to be very careful, and very smart. Sarah pulled out her laptop. If Karen wants to play detective, maybe it's time someone investigated her. The next morning, Sarah dropped Emma at school and drove to the county courthouse. Public records were exactly that, public. Within 2 hours, she'd compiled a fascinating picture of Karen Whitmore's recent history, 3 previous addresses in the last 4 years, 2 restraining orders filed against former neighbors in different states, multiple small claims court cases over property disputes, a pattern of behavior that painted Karen not as a concerned citizen, but as a serial neighborhood terrorist. But the most interesting discovery was Karen's employment history. She'd been fired from her last job, a position with a property management company, for creating a hostile work environment and exceeding professional boundaries with tenants. Sarah was photocopying the documents when her phone rang. Mrs. Chen, this is Janet Rodriguez from Child Protective Services. Sarah's blood turned to ice. Yes, we've received a report of concern regarding your daughter Emma. We'd like to schedule a home visit to discuss the circumstances surrounding a recent accident. The courthouse suddenly felt too small, too hot. Sarah gripped the phone with white knuckles. A report from whom? I can't disclose the source of the report, but we take all concerns about child safety seriously. Would tomorrow afternoon work for you? Sarah's mind raced. She could refuse. Demand a warrant, lawyer up immediately, but that would only make her look guilty, defensive, and Emma had already been through enough trauma without adding a contentious CPS investigation to the mix. Of course, Sarah heard herself saying, "What time?" After hanging up, Sarah sat in her car in the courthouse parking lot, shaking with rage and fear. Karen had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. She'd weaponized Emma's accident, turned a mother's worst nightmare into ammunition for her petty war. But two could play that game. Sarah drove straight to the law office of Mitchell and Associates, a firm that specialized in harassment and defamation cases. The consultation fee was expensive, but the lawyer, Patricia Mitchell, was immediately interested when Sarah laid out the timeline of Karen's escalating behavior. "This is a textbook case of neighbor harassment," Mitchell said, reviewing the documents. Sarah had brought the complaint letters, the investigation into your personal life. The CPS report. It's a clear pattern of retaliatory behavior. What can we do about it? Several things. We can file for a restraining order based on the harassment. We can sue for defamation if she's spreading false information about your family. And if the CPS investigation proves to be based on false or malicious reports, we can pursue charges for filing false reports with government agencies. Sarah felt a grim satisfaction settling in her chest. How long will all this take? That depends on how hard she wants to fight. But based on what you've shown me about her history, Mitchell smiled coldly, I don't think she's going to want this to go to court. People like Karen Whitmore rely on intimidation and bureaucratic harassment because they can't win in actual, legal proceedings. That afternoon, Sarah was back in her yard with a sledgehammer when Karen appeared at the property line. But this time, she wasn't alone. A thin man in an expensive suit stood beside her, along with a woman holding a clipboard and wearing a badge that read Envy. PART3. The CPS caseworker, Janet Rodriguez, arrived at exactly 2 p.m. with a gentle smile and kind eyes that didn't fool Sarah for a second. Behind that maternal facade was someone with the power to tear families apart, and Karen had put this weapon directly in her hands. "Mrs. Chen, thank you for accommodating us on short notice," Janet said, as Sarah led her into the living room. "As I mentioned on the phone, we just need to have a brief conversation about Emma's accident and her current well-being." David sat beside Sarah on the couch, his jaw tight with barely controlled anger. "Before we begin, we want to be clear that we're cooperating fully, but we also want to understand exactly what allegations have been made against us." Janet's expression remained professionally neutral. "I can't discuss the specifics of the report, but I can tell you that concerns were raised about supervision, home safety, and Emma's emotional state following a traumatic incident." "Concerns raised by someone who's never set foot in our house," Sarah said flatly. "Someone who's been harassing us for weeks because we won't bow to her self-appointed authority." "Mrs. Chen, I understand you're upset, but my job is to focus on Emma's well-being, regardless of the source of the report." Janet pulled out a tablet. "Can you tell me about the day of the accident?" Sarah had rehearsed this conversation in her mind dozens of times, but actually living it felt surreal. She walked Janet through every detail, putting away groceries. Emma's request to go outside, the faulty gate latch that had since been replaced, Mrs. Patterson's quick response, the paramedics, the hospital, and Emma's recovery, Janet asked. "Physically, she's fine. Emotionally, ... Sarah's voice caught. "She's been having nightmares. She won't go near any water, not even the bathtub without one of us there. That's why we're removing the poolets. A constant reminder of the worst day of her life." Janet made notes on her tablet. "I'd like to speak with Emma now, if that's all right." Sarah's protective instincts screamed against letting anyone interrogate her daughter, but she knew refusing would only make things worse. "Of course, but please remember, she's 6 years old and she's been through trauma." Emma appeared a few minutes later, clutching her favorite stuffed elephant. She settled onto the couch between her parents, eyeing Janet with the wariness of a child who'd learned that adults sometimes brought scary questions. "Hi Emma," Janet said softly. "I'm Ms. Janet. I just want to ask you a few questions, okay?" Emma nodded but pressed closer to Sarah's side. "Can you tell me about your accident?" Emma's small voice was barely above a whisper. "I fell in the water. Do you remember how that happened? I wanted to see the flowers by the pool. The gate was open, and I slipped." Emma looked up at her parents. "Mommy and Daddy weren't mad at me." Janet continued her gentle questioning for another 10 minutes, covering Emma's daily routine, how she felt at home, whether she ever felt scared or unsafe. With each answer, Sarah felt a mix of pride in her daughter's articulate responses and rage at Karen for putting them through this ordeal. Finally, Janet closed her tablet. "Emma, you've been very helpful. Would you like to go play while I talk to your parents a little more?" After Emma left the room, Janet's professional demeanor softened slightly. "Mrs. Chen, Mr. Chen, I want to be straightforward with you. Based on what I've observed today and Emma's responses, I see no evidence of neglect or unsafe conditions. This appears to have been a tragic accident in a loving home. Sarah felt her shoulders drop with relief she didn't realize she'd been holding. However, Janet continued, I am required to complete a full investigation. I'll need to interview your neighbors, Emma's teachers, and your family doctor. The process typically takes 30 days. 30 days of having this hanging over our heads, David said grimly. I understand this is stressful, but I can tell you that cases like this, where the report seems motivated by personal conflict rather than genuine concern, usually resolve quickly once we gather all the information. After Janet left, Sarah stood at her kitchen window watching Karen's house. She could see movement behind the curtains, a shadow hovering near the window as if Karen was monitoring the CPS visit. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from her. Lawyer, restraining order hearing scheduled for Friday. Need you to document any additional contact or harassment. As if summoned by the message, Sarah's doorbell rang. She opened it to find a delivery driver holding a certified letter. Mrs. Chen, sign here please. Sarah's hands trembled as she opened the envelope. It was from the city building department, informing her that multiple neighbors had complained about ongoing construction noise, and demanding she cease all work until a formal hearing could be scheduled. The lies were escalating. Sarah had been working for maybe 2 hours that morning, well within city noise ordinances, using nothing louder than a sledgehammer, but 3 signatures were at the bottom of the complaint: Karen Whitmore, James Henderson, and Rita Martinez. Sarah didn't recognize the Martinez name, but Henderson had to be the new neighbor Mrs. Patterson had mentioned. Karen was building a coalition, recruiting allies who didn't know the full story. That evening, Sarah decided it was time to stop playing defense. She walked across the street to the Martinez house and rang the doorbell. A woman in her 40s answered, looking confused to see Sarah on her doorstep. Mrs. Martinez, I'm Sarah Chen from across the street. I believe you signed a noise complaint about my property. The woman's face immediately flushed with embarrassment. Oh, Mrs. Chen, I didn't realize. Karen said you were running some kind of unlicensed construction business out of your backyard. She showed us pictures of heavy machinery and debris piles. Heavy machinery. Sarah almost laughed. I'm using a sledgehammer to remove my pool. Sledgehammer, but Karen said. She had photos of excavators and dump trucks. Sarah pulled out her phone and showed Mrs. Martinez pictures of her actual work. See a half-demolished above-ground pool, a rented dumpster, and basic hand tools. Mrs. Martinez stared at the photos, then looked back at Sarah with growing alarm. She lied to us. Mrs. Martinez, did Karen tell you why I'm removing the pool? She said you were trying to avoid property taxes by eliminating the pool without proper permits? Sarah took a deep breath and told the story one more time: Emma's accident, the trauma, the decision to remove the source of their pain. With each detail, Mrs. Martinez looked more horrified. Oh my God, she whispered when Sarah finished. Your poor baby, and we, We signed a complaint to stop you from. She couldn't finish the sentence. Karen didn't mention any of that. She said you were a problem neighbor who didn't respect community standards. She made it sound like you were running some kind of illegal operation. Mrs. Martinez was clearly struggling with the realization of how she'd been manipulated. Mrs. Chen, I am so sorry. I'll withdraw my signature from that complaint first thing tomorrow. What about Mr. Henderson? Mrs. Martinez's expression darkened. He's very concerned about property values. He just bought that house as an investment property, and he's planning to flip it next year. Karen convinced him you were going to tank the neighborhood values. Do you think he'd be willing to listen? To the truth, I don't know. He's not a very empathetic person. Sarah thanked Mrs. Martinez and walked home, her mind already working on the next step. She couldn't control Henderson's response, but she could control how much ammunition Karen had to work with. The next morning, Sarah was up at dawn documenting everything. She photographed her worksite from every angle, timed her work sessions, recorded decibel levels with a phone app, and compiled a detailed log of every sledgehammer swing. Then she started calling her other neighbors, but Mrs. Patterson was already firmly in Sarah's corner. The Johnsons were appalled when Sarah told them about the CPS report and immediately offered to serve as character witnesses. The elderly couple next door, the Washingtons, had been following the situation with growing concern and were happy to provide written statements about Sarah's character and the actual noise levels from her work. By noon, Sarah had statements from 6 different neighbors contradicting Karen's claims, but she also discovered something troubling. Karen had been telling different stories to different people. To the Martinezes, Sarah was running an unlicensed construction business. To Henderson, she was deliberately tanking property values out of spite. To the elderly Washingtons, she was having a mental breakdown and posed a danger to the neighborhood children. Karen wasn't just filing complaints. She was running a deliberate disinformation campaign. That afternoon, Sarah was in her yard when she noticed Henderson walking toward her property. He was a tall, thin man in his 50s with the kind of sharp suit and aggressive posture that screamed real estate investor. Mrs. Chen, he called out as he approached. I think we need to have a conversation. Sarah set down her sledgehammer and turned to face him. About what, Mr. Henderson? About this? He gestured broadly at her worksite. about what you're doing to our property values. I'm removing a pool from my own backyard. You're creating an eyesore that's going to cost all of us money when we try to sell." Henderson's voice carried the authority of someone used to getting his way in business negotiations. "I've got $60,000 invested in this neighborhood, and I'm not going to let one selfish homeowner tank my investment." Sarah felt a familiar. The final battle began with a phone call at 6:30 a.m. on a Friday morning. Sarah jolted awake to an unknown number, her heart immediately racing. Early calls always meant emergency. "Mrs. Chen? This is Detective Morrison with the police department. We need you to come down to the station for questioning regarding allegations of child endangerment and reckless endangerment of neighbors." Sarah's blood turned to ice. "What allegations?" "Ma'am, I'd prefer to discuss this in person. Can you be here by 9 a.m.? After hanging up, Sarah sat on the edge of her bed, hands shaking. David was already reaching for his phone to call their lawyer, but Sarah knew with sickening certainty that Karen and Henderson had found a new weapon: criminal charges. Patricia Mitchell met them at the police station, her expression grim, claiming, "You've created dangerous conditions that endanger neighborhood children, and that your destruction of the pool shows a pattern of reckless behavior that led to Emma's accident." That's insane. It's strategic. They can't win in civil court with what they have. So they're trying to get criminal charges that would force you to stop work and potentially remove Emma from the home during the investigation. Detective Morrison was a heavy-set man in his 50s who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. He led them into a stark interview room and laid out a manila folder thick with documents. "Mrs. Chen, we've received multiple reports alleging that you've created hazardous conditions in your backyard, that you're disposing of potentially toxic materials improperly, and that your behavior pattern suggests negligence that contributed to your daughter's near drowning." Sarah stared at the folder, recognizing Karen's handiwork. "Detective, have you actually seen my backyard?" "Not personally, but we have photographs and witness statements from people who have a documented history of harassing my family." Sarah's voice remained steady despite her racing heart. "Detective, before we go any further, I think you should know that I have a restraining order hearing scheduled for this afternoon against one of your complainants, and evidence that this is part of an ongoing harassment campaign." Morris' expression shifted slightly. "Ma'am." Patricia Mitchell opened her briefcase and pulled out a thick file. "Detective, my client has been the victim of a systematic harassment campaign for the past month. We have documented evidence of frivolous complaints, false reports to multiple agencies, attempts to manipulate neighbors with false information, and threats of economic retaliation." She spread documents across the table, the stack of complaint letters, witness statements from neighbors, records of Karen's previous restraining orders in other states, Henderson's own admission that he wanted to force Sarah to rebuild the pool for economic reasons. Morrison studied the documents, his frown deepening. This Henderson character really said he wanted to force her to rebuild the pool where her kid almost drowned. In front of witnesses, Patricia confirmed. He stated that he didn't care about the child's trauma if it affected his property investment. Returns. The detective was quiet for a long moment, flipping through the evidence. Finally, he looked up at Sarah. "Mrs. Chen, I'm going to be straight with you. When I first saw these complaints, they looked serious. Endangering children, reckless behavior, pattern of negligence. But now, ... He gestured at Patricia's documents. "This looks like somebody trying to weaponize the system against you." "That's exactly what it is. The question is, what do we do about it?" Morrison leaned back in his chair. "These are serious allegations that have been formally filed. I can't just ignore them." Patricia leaned forward. "Detective, what if I told you we have evidence that at least one of these complainants has filed false police reports in multiple jurisdictions?" Morrison's eyebrows rose. "I'd say that changes things significantly." Over the next hour, Patricia laid out Karen's complete history, the pattern of neighbor conflicts, the previous restraining orders, the job termination for harassment. More damaging was Henderson's background check, which revealed to previous lawsuits in other states where he'd tried to force neighbors to modify their properties to protect his investment values. "This isn't about child safety or neighborhood concerns," Patricia concluded. "This is about two individuals who found each other and decided to destroy a family that won't submit to their control." Morrison gathered up the documents. "Mrs. Chen, I'm going to recommend that the DA decline to file charges. But I want you to understand something. These people aren't going to stop. They've escalated 2 criminal allegations, which means they're getting desperate. Desperate people do unpredictable things." As they left the police station, Sarah felt a mix of relief and apprehension. They'd won this battle, but Morrison was right. Karen and Henderson were escalating, and desperate enemies were dangerous enemies. The restraining order hearing that afternoon was anticlimactic. Karen showed up with her manila folders and her self-righteous indignation, but Judge Martinez had clearly done her homework. "Ms. Whitmore," the judge said dryly, "I see from your record that you've been involved in similar disputes in Connecticut, Florida, and Tennessee. Would you care to explain this pattern?" Karen's confident demeanor cracked. "Your Honor, I'm simply a concerned citizen who believes in community standards that require calling Child Protective Services on a family dealing with trauma. filing false police reports, attempting to force a mother to rebuild the pool where her child nearly died. I never said Ms. Whitmore. I've reviewed the evidence, including recorded conversations and witness statements. The restraining order is granted. You are to have no contact with the Chen family, directly or indirectly. You are not to file any further reports or complaints regarding their property unless you have clear evidence of actual violations. You are not to discuss the Chen family with other neighbors or community members. Judge Martinez turned to Sarah. Mrs. Chen, if Ms. Whitmore violates this order in any way, she will face criminal charges for contempt of court. As they left the courthouse, Karen's face was a mask of pure hatred. She stood on the courthouse steps, phone pressed to her ear, speaking in urgent whispers. Sarah didn't need to hear the conversation to know Karen was calling Henderson, regrouping, planning their next attack. That evening, Sarah was finally back in her yard with the sledgehammer when Mrs. Patterson appeared at the fence line, looking agitated. Sarah dear, I think you should know there's been some very strange activity at Karen's house today. Sarah paused mid-swing. What kind of activity? Well, after the hearing, she came home and started loading things into her car. Boxes, suitcases, personal items. And then around dinner time, a moving truck showed up. Sarah felt a surge of hope. She's moving. It looks that way. But here's the strange part. Henderson was there too, and they were arguing loudly. I couldn't make out most of it, but I distinctly heard him say something about cutting losses and damage control. Sarah's hope began to curdle into suspicion. Karen didn't seem like the type to retreat from a fight, especially not after escalating to criminal charges and restraining orders. If she was leaving, it was either because she'd given up completely, or because she was planning something that required distance. The answer came at 2 a.m., when Sarah woke to the sound of sirens. She looked out her bedroom window to see fire trucks racing down their street, their red lights painting the neighborhood in hellish shadows. David was already at the window beside her, pointing toward the end of the block. It's Henderson's house, he said grimly. They threw on clothes and joined the crowd of neighbors gathering on the sidewalk. Henderson's investment property was fully engulfed in flames, the fire so intense that the heat could be felt from 3 houses away. Fire Chief Reynolds was directing operations when Sarah approached him. Chief, was anyone hurt? Property was vacant, thank God. But this fire? He shook his head. This wasn't accidental. Someone used accelerant, probably gasoline, and they knew exactly what they were doing. Sarah's blood chilled. Arson textbook case, started in multiple locations simultaneously, burned too hot and too fast to be anything else. Reynolds looked around at the gathered neighbors. You folks should be careful. Someone willing to torch a house might not stop there. Sarah looked around for Henderson, but didn't see him in the crowd. Most of the neighbors were in robes and pajamas, clearly awakened by the sirens. But Henderson was nowhere to be found. Neither was Karen. The next morning, Detective Morrison called Sarah directly. Mrs. Chen, I need to ask you some questions about last night's fire. Of course, but I don't know anything beyond what I saw. Where were you between midnight and 2 a.m.? Sarah felt a chill of realization. In bed, asleep. David can vouch for that, detective. You don't think? I think someone torched Henderson's house about 6 hours after you were granted a restraining order against his partner in this harassment campaign. That's quite a coincidence, detective. I would never. I don't think you did it, Mrs. Chen, but I think someone wants me to think you did it. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. Karen hadn't fled in defeat. She'd escalated to a level that even Henderson hadn't anticipated. She'd burned down his investment property, probably figuring the insurance money would compensate him for the losses Sarah had caused to his property values. But more sinister was the timing. If suspicion